The gavel hadn't even fallen on the last lot when Earl Whitfield felt his boots stop moving on their own. He was standing in a dusty auction lot outside Emporia, Kansas, late September, the kind of afternoon where the heat hasn't quite let go of summer, but the light already carries that thinner, slanted look of autumn. Around him, maybe 150 people drifted between rows of retired machinery, hay wagons, a couple of grain trucks with rust blooming along the wheel wells, a stack of fence posts nobody particularly wanted. Just an ordinary consignment sale, the kind that happens every fall when an estate settles or a family finally decides it's time to let go. Earl had come for a disc harrow, nothing more than that, but past a faded blue farmel, past a row of plowshares, sat a small orange tractor, a Kubota L245, and something in his chest simply stopped. If stories like this about the land, the people who work it in the quiet, strange ways justice sometimes finds its way home, means something to you, stay with us. We tell one of these every week. And if your own family's got a story like it, leave it in the comments below. We read every single one. Now, let's go back to where it started. Spring 1960. Earl Whitfield was 26 years old, farming 110 acres of wheat and milo just outside Council Grove, Kansas, alongside his father, Alton. The Whitfields weren't wealthy men. Nobody much was in that stretch of the Flint Hills. It was cattle and wheat country, hard red winter wheat that came up thin some years and thick in others, and you never really knew which kind of year you got until it was too late to do anything about it. Earl had married young, a woman named Ruth, and they had a 2-year-old daughter in a farmhouse Alton had built with his own hands back in the 30s. Earl worked the ground from before first light until well past dark most days, and when he was in the fields, he was fixing something, a fence line, a water pump, a piece of machinery that had no business still running, and somehow ran anyway, because that's what you did when money was tight and equipment was dear. That spring, father and son scraped together enough between 2 harvests to buy a used Kubota L245 off a dealer up in Topeka. Not new, it already had 3 years on it, but solid. A 20-some horsepower diesel utility tractor, small enough to slip into tight corners around the barn lots, strong enough to pull a mower or a small disc when the work called for it. $1,100. No small sum. Back then, Earl remembered signing the note at the bank, like it was yesterday. Remembered the loan officer telling him wheat prices had better hold. That little tractor became Earl's daily hands. He hauled feed with it, mowed the ditches with it, dragged the trailer fence posts out to wherever a line needed mending. And within that first summer, he'd already left his mark on it, literally. A hinge pin on the loader arm sheared clean off while he was moving a round bale, and rather than wait 2 weeks for a replacement to come to mail, Earl fabricated one himself out of scrap rod and welded a reinforcing plate onto the left side of the loader frame to keep it from happening again. It wasn't pretty work. It was a kind of weld only the man who laid it down would ever recognize on sight, a rough double bead that curled slightly at the top. By the following spring, that Kubota was as familiar to Earl as the sound of his own front door. Then, on the morning of March 3rd, 1960, Earl walked out to machine shed before sunup to hitch the tractor to a trailer of fence posts, and the shed was empty. No forced entry. There rarely was. In that part of Kansas, in those days, nobody locked a machine shed. Half the farms in Morris County didn't even own doors that latched properly, because it had simply never occurred to anyone that they'd need to. Neighbors came and went. Tools got borrowed and returned a week later, without so much as a phone call first. It was a kind of trust that isn't talked about much anymore, mostly because it doesn't exist in quite the same way anymore. Earl called the Morris County Sheriff's Office that morning. A deputy came out, walked the empty shed, took down what little there was to take down. No tire tracks worth photographing, no witnesses, just an empty space where a tractor used to sit. Earl gave the serial number from memory, best he could manage, and that night, sitting at the kitchen table with Ruth across from him and their daughter asleep down the hall, Earl did something that would end up mattering more than either of them could have possibly guessed. He pulled out an old canvas-covered ledger, the one Alton had used for years to track feed purchases and cattle sales, flipped to a blank page near the back, and in pencil, in his own hand, wrote down the make, the model, the serial number of the stolen tractor, and the date. Underneath, almost as an afterthought, he added one more line. Repair weld, left side loader frame, done by E.W. Summer 59. He didn't know why he wrote that part down. He just did. The sheriff's office made what inquiries it could, which in 1960 wasn't much. There was no shared registry between counties, let alone states. A stolen tractor could cross a county line and simply disappear into the ordinary churn of farm sales, and there was almost no way to stop it. If whoever took it moved fast enough, the odds of ever seeing it again dropped to next to nothing within days. The insurance paid out a partial claim. Never enough. It never is. Earl and Alton scraped together the rest and bought another tractor that summer. Older, rougher, and life on the farm went on the way it has to. But Earl never quite stopped looking for that little orange Kubota. Not in any way that kept him from living his life. Just somewhere in the back of a room in his mind, there was always a small, quiet part of him doing the math whenever he passed a farm auction, whenever an orange tractor caught the light a certain way from the road. By 1983, the world around Earl Whitfield had changed in most of the ways a world does over 23 years. Alton had passed in 1971. Ruth was still beside him, though her hands had grown stiffer than either of them liked to admit. Their daughter, Carol, had grown up, married a man from Wichita, and moved off the farm, though she called every Sunday without fail. Their son, Dale, had taken over the row crop operation and expanded it, leasing another 80 acres from a neighbor, easing into retirement. Earl was 69 years old. The story of the stolen Kubota had become, over the decades, just that, a story, something told over coffee at the co-op, not with any real bitterness left in it anymore, just the way farmers talk about the drought of '56 or the flood of '51, a fact of the land, a thing that had simply happened once, a long time ago. Until that September afternoon at the consignment auction outside Emporia, a little more than an hour from where it all began, when Earl Whitfield stood in a dusty lot and felt his boots forget, for just a moment, how to walk. Earl didn't move for a long moment. Around him the auction kept right on going, the auctioneer's voice rolling over a set of disc harrows 3 rows down, bidders calling out numbers, a couple of dogs trotting between the crowd's legs looking for scraps of somebody's sandwich. Nobody else in that lot had any reason to stop walking. Only Earl. He made himself take a step. Then another. 23 years is a long time, he told himself. There have to be hundreds of these things still running somewhere between Nebraska and Oklahoma. Orange paint, that same boxy little frame. It wasn't as if Kubota had only built the one, but then he got close enough to see the left side of the loader frame. The weld was still there, rougher now, dulled under decades of grease and dust, but unmistakable. That same double bead, curling slightly at the top, exactly the way it curled this summer he'd laid it down with his own 2 hands in 1959. Earl crouched next to it, feeling every one of the 69 years in his knees, and ran his thumb along the old bead like he was checking to see if it was real. He found the serial plate low on the frame, half hidden under a film of dried mud. He wiped it clean with the cuff of his sleeve and read it twice. Then he reached into his coat pocket for the small notebook. He still carried out a habit, the same kind of habit Ruth used to tease him about, a farmer who wrote everything down whether it needed writing or not, and flipped back through years of scrawled notes on cattle prices and parts numbers until he found the page. Not the original 1960 ledger. That one had long since been retired to a shelf in the house. But years before, sensing the old book was getting fragile, Earl had copied the entry over by hand into whatever notebook he happened to be carrying that season. He'd done it 3 or 4 times over the decades, copying the same lines forward, the way you might carry a photograph from one wallet to the next. The serial number matched, every digit. Earl stood up slowly, and for a moment he just stood there in the middle of that dusty lot doing absolutely nothing at all, while a round in the auction carried on as if the whole world hadn't just tilted slightly on its axis. He didn't make a scene. That wasn't Earl's way. He found a payphone at the gas station down the road and called the Lyon County Sheriff's Office. The deputy on the line was polite but plainly skeptical. A man calling about a tractor stolen 23 years earlier is not, generally speaking, a call that gets treated as urgent. But when Earl read him the serial number from his notebook And then the sheriff pulled the old Morris County report from wherever such things get filed away for that long. The two numbers lined up, and the tone on the other end of the line changed considerably. He was told not to leave the auction grounds. Someone would be out shortly. What came together over the following days wasn't dramatic. It rarely is in real life. It was something quieter and in its own way, sadder. The tractor, it turned out, had been consigned to the auction by a family settling the estate of a man named Otto Rademacher, a farmer who had died that summer at 81, having owned and worked that same 80 acres near Emporia for nearly 40 years. Otto's children had no particular knowledge of where the little orange tractor had come from, only that their father had bought it, by his own account, from a traveling equipment dealer sometime back in 1960, a man who told him had belonged to a farmer up north who was retiring and heading west. Whoever that dealer really was, and whatever he'd actually done, there was no way left to ask him. He'd have to have been an old man himself by 1983, if he was alive at all, and no name attached to the sale had ever been properly recorded. Otto Rademacher had simply bought a tractor in good faith, used it honestly for 23 years, and passed on, having done nothing wrong except trust a stranger's word. The auction house, after consulting their own legal counsel, released the tractor pending resolution of the ownership claim. Kansas law on recovered stolen property was straightforward enough once the paperwork lined up. The matching serial number, the original 1960 sheriff's report, and Earl's own handwritten notation about a weld he'd made himself, a detail nobody but the true owner could have possibly known to write down in the first place. 6 weeks later, Earl Whitfield Sundale backed a flatbed trailer up to the Rademacher place and loaded the old Kubota L245 for the drive home. Earl didn't say much when it arrived. He walked around it slowly, the way a man walks around something he isn't quite ready to believe is real. And when he got to the left side of the loader frame, he stopped and rested his hand flat against the old weld for a long moment, saying nothing at all. Ruth, watching from the porch, said later that he looked like a man doing arithmetic in his head, adding up years, maybe, or something there isn't really a way to add up. The next morning, Earl filled the tank, checked the oil, and started it. It caught on the second try, rough at first, then smoothing out into that same low diesel knock he remembered from a lifetime ago. He drove it out to the ditch along the county road and mowed a stretch of grass that didn't especially need mowing, just to feel it under him again. He never framed it as some grand vindication. When people asked him about it at the co-op afterward, Earl would just shrug and say the tractor had always been his. And now the paperwork agreed with him. That was about as much as he ever said on the subject. But what Earl took from the whole affair, in his own quiet way, wasn't really about the tractor at all. It was about a pencil and a page in an old ledger. A single line, written almost as an afterthought on a hard night in 1960, describing a well nobody else in the world would ever have thought to write down. That line had outlasted a partial insurance settlement, 23 years of county paperwork, and the memory of everyone else involved outlasted, in the end, even the man who'd sold the tractor in the first place. Earl Whitfield still has that ledger. And somewhere on the Whitfield place outside Council Grove, Kansas, a Kubota L245 with a rough, hand-laid weld on its left loader frame is still out there doing exactly what it was always built to do. If you believe that honest labor, the kind that gets done quietly, without anyone watching, without anyone asking for thanks, deserves to be protected and remembered, then you already understand exactly why we tell stories like this one. Subscribe if this one found you. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if somebody in your own family has a story like Earl's, a thing lost, a thing found again, years later, against every reasonable expectation, we'd like to hear it.